Welcome to Old Path Ministries in our study through the book of 1 Kings. We make it to chapter 16 today, and we'll see how far we get into this. It's kind of an interesting part of their history, and right up front I'll just make mention of the fact that in this particular part of it, as we go through Kings, there's kind of a back and forth of mentions of some kings where there's hardly anything said about them, and they're really, for the most part, pretty unremarkable people. And aside from just how wicked they were, but that really doesn't get a lot of discussion. Oddly enough, there is a king that we will, of course, by name, we already probably know about him, Ahab. And every once in a while, you'll have a king, because of what God is doing kind of simultaneously, will become much more prominent. And in this case, that's because Elijah is shown to us in this section. So we're going to get introduced to him. He is mentioned in our text today. We probably won't have time to deal with both chapters 18 and 19. If we get to chapter 18 and do all that, great. But what you have is, most of us are probably familiar with what happened with Elijah and the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. But then what happened after is in chapter 19, and there's no sense in really trying to run all of those things together. So we may break between 18 and 19. We'll just see how time goes on this. But I'll probably put up some pictures as well of what part or where Carmel is and what you actually see when you're there. So it's a place that's well known in Israel, and we'll deal with that when we get to the particular passages. So chapter 16 kind of just goes through a little bit of the progression of the and kind of even the intrigues, if you will, of the northern kingdom and the kings that were taking place after Jeroboam, and the kind of just incredible wickedness that there was taking place in the north. And you've heard me say it a number of times, there was never a time when the kings of the north were good kings. So beginning at Jeroboam, it was always a series of kings. It was always going to be a series of kings that would provoke God to wrath and to anger, and got into just rank and blatant idolatry. So once again, we can see the reason for that. It's so obvious, even as far as Ahab is concerned. The person that he marries, Jezebel, as we know her, is not Jewish, Sidonian instead, and somebody who was just an idolater from the very beginning. So the same people that God didn't want them having interaction with, now the kings are marrying them. And really, it was kind of begun, that happened a whole lot because of Solomon, and kind of it was a real downward progression from that point. In fact, I know that we had talked about it, but really because of the actions of Solomon, it set in motion what was going to be a plague, if you will, to both Judah and to Israel through the rest of their history. And idolatry made its way into Israel. The very thing God warned them about, they ignored. And as a result of it, this is what we're reading. So kind of a sad history for sure. So anyhow, chapter 16, let's have a word of prayer, and let's go ahead and take a look at the text. Father, we thank you that we can come to your word, and that we can seek you, and we pray that you would give us understanding hearts and minds as we study through your word, and as we look at the history of it. May we make proper application as we understand these things, and may we grow in our knowledge of who you are and what you would have us to know. We give you all thanks and pray that you would guide us in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 16 starts this way. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha, saying," now Baasha was the king that had taken over in the north, and of course it was going to be, there's going to be a series of these guys that God has to address, and they all have these problems in common. "Inasmuch as I lifted you out of the dust and made you ruler over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and you have made my people sin to provoke me to anger with their sins." Now, of course, this is important when it comes to the understanding of government as a whole. And so, is God holding the people accountable and responsible for their individual wickedness? Absolutely. But would he go to the leaders and hold the leaders responsible for the misery that they have introduced into the nation? Absolutely. Now, that is more important to Israel than to any other nation that has ever been created, because God visited directly the people at the beginning of this, whether it be Abraham or Moses or Joshua or even in the Kings, to David and to Solomon. For that matter, Jeroboam was told directly by God, walk rightly before me and you'll have an enduring kingdom. But we know exactly what he did. He did the polar opposite of that, and it wiped out his entire family. Now, here you have the same situation that's taking place in the next generation down, and the same wickedness is in place. They know what they're supposed to do. They refuse to do it. Now, to a lesser extent, I will take the side as far as places like, if we want to look at the United States. We're not a covenant people. We never have been. God did not visit, George Washington or anyone else and make a covenant with him and the land and the people. So that idea that people want to try to make the U.S. something like Israel is just absurd on its face. However, will God hold people accountable for what they know and for what they have been given? Did God bless this nation? I believe absolutely he did. Were there many people who were just kind of secular or even had some weird spiritual beliefs at the founding of the nation? No question about it. Were there people who were solid believers? Absolutely. Go read their writings. These guys were clued in to who Jesus was. These were men that I would have no doubt were born again, just reading what they write. Born again people write those kind of things. Ones that are not, do not. So we can look back at our nation and say, we're not a covenant nation in the way that Israel was, but we would have a greater accountability before God because of what was given to us. So in modern times, as I look at 2021 as I record this, the idea that we have so far abandoned our original principles and our reliance upon God, we provoke him to the same kind of anger because of our wickedness that any nation would possibly have done. Israel's just in a different category because to them were given the oracles. They were the ones given the law. So we live in the New Testament. That is given to all of mankind, Jew and Gentile alike. It is not a nationalistic thing. So anyway, what you have here is an admission and a way of just kind of making it pretty obvious that the condition of the nation will oftentimes follow its leadership. And that's acknowledged here by what God just said. Now in verse 3 it says, surely I will take away the posterity of Baasha and the posterity of his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now remember what happened to him. God just said, as far as this is concerned, your whole house is going to lie in ruins, and you won't have any children as your inheritance to take your place when you're gone. So it says here in verse 4, the dogs will eat whoever belongs to Baasha and dies in the city, and the birds of the air will eat whoever dies in the fields. Now, the rest of the acts of Baasha, what he did and his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Now, what we know, this is again, just in case this is the first time that you've heard that, this is not the book of Chronicles that we'll be studying after we're done with Kings. That was written much later, even later than this, clearly. So the speculation is there was just a record, if you will, a written history, which they were very careful to keep. We know that even from the time back in Numbers and Deuteronomy, and those ones that the genealogies are really precise. So that was just so that could be preserved for the generations. They did a similar thing seemingly here with the kings, and that journal, if you will, or that writing was something that followed them historically. Many believe that that very same book is what may have informed 1st and 2nd Kings and, of course, 1st and 2nd Chronicles to some extent. Anyhow, it is a different book entirely. It's just named the same. So, the rest of the acts of Baasha and what he did and his might, they're written in that book. So Baasha rested with his fathers and was buried in Tisra. Then Elah, his son, reigned in his place. Now, this is just a way of saying he rested with his fathers. It wouldn't have been a restful thing as we would consider it because of his wickedness. It just means that when he died, this is where he was buried along with those of his family. So it says, and also the word of the Lord came by the prophet Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha and his house, because all of the evil that he did in the sight of the Lord in provoking him to anger with the work of his hands, and being like the household of Jeroboam, and because he killed them. So this is something that God keeps an account of, and the reason why the things happened as they did. And what you find is there's not a lot of detail given to us, like a prophet comes to him, like we're going to find with Elijah and what happens with Ahab and Jezebel. But what you have here, nonetheless, is that God did keep record of it. And Baasha was just this wicked guy, and we see what happened and how he had come to power, and now he is going to be taken out in the same way that he came to power. So it tells us in verse 8, now in the 26th year of Asa, the king of Judah. So with all of this turmoil, Asa is now, has been in there for all of these, more than a couple of decades. And here, the north is starting to go through a succession of brief reigns of kings. And again, the wickedness is just, it is astounding. So it says, it was in the 26th year of Asa, the king of Judah, that Elah, the son of Baasha, became king over all of Israel, and he reigned for 2 years in Tisra. And so his servant Zimri was a commander of half of his chariots, and he conspired against him as he was in Tisra, drinking himself drunk in the house of Azra, the steward of his house in Tisra. So once again, now you have what is kind of a military coup. This is a guy who really has one other rival, half of his chariots. This is just a guy who's clearly well up there as far as stature is concerned, and he conspires, wants the king dead. And what you're going to find here, once again, is kind of a repeat. If you're going to get rid of the king, you've got to get rid of all of his heirs as well, so that there's not a rival for who would be the next king, even though it was done by murder, which is kind of an amazing thing. So it tells us, so Zimri went in and he struck him, and he killed him in the 27th year of Asa, the king of Judah, and he reigned in his place. So as you see here, it's no longer that idea of the calling that God would put upon the kings. Remember how this all started. God didn't want kings in the nation. He knew what was coming down the road. He knew that this would be their history, and this is going to be the course of things. He would much rather for them to have just looked to him as Moses would have, or as Joshua would have hundreds of years before this. And that would have been sufficient. Let God govern his people through the person that God uses to do that very thing. Well, from generation to generation, there's obviously a degrading that takes place. They're no longer having God be the one who directs them. Now it's just something that is kind of traded off and handed down from one group to another. And if it can be taken by force, that's what they will do in this case here. So all the while, God is on the outside looking into this and saying, I want to be able to lead my people, but they will not be governed by me. So they're governing themselves, and God is all along saying, I'm going to hold accountable the people who are doing the things that they are doing, and the same cruelty that they showed towards another seems to be visited on them pretty consistently. Well, in verse 11, and it came to pass, when he began to reign, as soon as he was seated on his throne, that he killed all the household of Baasha. He did not leave him one male, neither of his relatives, nor even of his friends. And thus Zimri destroyed all of the household of Baasha, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke against Baasha by Jehu the prophet. So what we just read now is the immediate falling out of what ended up being, or what God said was going to happen. Now it's being played out in front of them. And so God said it was going to happen. It happens in pretty short order thereafter. So verse 13 says, now all the servants, or rather all the sins of Baasha, and all the sins of Elah, his son, by which he had sinned, and by which he had made Israel to sin in provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. So this is, once again, a progression that continues to happen, and it never finds any remedy in the north. What we will find as we go through the south and the southern kings, there are those times when it seems just as wicked as any other of these other kings, but something takes place where God sends a prophet and they listen. And so the hearts of the kings, for one reason or another, are either completely in a place of outright rebellion against God. That's all of them in the north and many of them in the south. But every once in a while, a good one comes along in the south that will take place. And so we'll see that as we go through. But by and large, just remember this. The idea that there were kings over the nation was never, and I said this just a little bit ago, it was never the intention of God. So what we have is a very clear representation that man can bring things on or take things on to himself, and God will allow those things to take place, but it isn't as though they're not going to be held accountable, and we're seeing a perfect example of it here. God doesn't want kings, and it wasn't his choice. They rebel against him, but they are not going to be left without having to give account for those things. And of course, unfortunately, they were giving account with their lives. So, verse 14. So the rest of the acts of Elah and what he did, they're written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. Now, in the 27th year of Asa, the king of Judah, Zimri had reigned in Tisra for 7 days. 7 days. And the people were encamped against Gibeathon, and which belonged to the Philistines. Now, the people who were encamped heard this, that Zimri had conspired, and also that he had killed the king. So all of Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, he made him king over Israel that day in the camp. And Omri and all Israel with him went up to Gibeathon, and they besieged Tisra. So this is the going into the area, and then ultimately the city, the citadel part of it, where the residence or the king's residence would be. It happened when Zimri saw that the city was taken, that he went out of the citadel, the king's house, and then he burned the king's house down upon himself with fire, and he died. It's not funny, because, I mean, this is just the human cost of this, of what happens to man when they rebel against God is just disgusting. But here he sees what he tried to take by force lasts about a week, and then there's a rebellion. What he's going to do in spite is to burn the place down so that nobody else can have it. In the process, he ends up killing himself because of his actions. And again, think about this. From the time that God comes to see Moses and lays out for him everything that he is going to do in bringing them into the land, it's come to this. Let's go further back than that. Imagine initially where God says to Abraham that I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and through you the nations will be blessed. So Genesis 12. And by the time that it is a son of his own life, he and Sarah, when he gets Isaac, then it is Isaac who ends up being the son of that promise. But when God was telling this to Abraham, that there was this amazing, heritage that was going to be left to him, to see it come to this is just nothing short of sad and tragic. So here we have it. It goes on. Now it says in verse 19, because of the sins which he had. Why did it happen? Why did he die? Well, it's because of the sins which he had committed in doing evil in the sight of the Lord, in walking the way of Jeroboam, and his sin which he had committed to make Israel sin. Now, that's a repeating passage, but think about this. It's only 7 days later. And so from the time that he, kind of takes it by force till the time that he ends up killing himself, trying to just burn the place down, and God still holds him accountable for continuing the wickedness that was taking place, in particular, without saying it so specifically, the very wickedness that brought him to power in the first place. He takes advantage of a man who is drunk, and he kills him and tries to take his possession. Verse 20. Now, the rest of the acts of Zimri and the treason he committed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles? So he refers to this, God refers to this also through the writer here, as a treasonous thing that he did by killing the king. A king who was just totally wicked anyway, but you get the picture of what's being shown there. So, verse 21. Then the people of Israel were divided into two parts. Half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, to make him the king, and the other half followed Omri. And the people who followed Omri prevailed against the people who followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, and so Tibni died and Omri reigned. So they killed him off. So Interestingly enough, this is just, again, the succession of now the powerful are taking place, rather than think back when David was told, if your son will walk honorably before me, so 2 Samuel, 7? If your son will walk honorably before me, then you will not fail to have one of your line, a king, to sit on my throne forever. If they will just walk with me. And it's come to this. This is how bad it has gotten. And it didn't take long. Think about that. It doesn't take long. It went David to Solomon, Solomon to this succession of nightmare just within a generation after Solomon had died. So, verse 24, and so he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. Now, Shemer is the person who owned it. This is the first place that you see in the text where it mentions Samaria. Now, I believe it's in chapter 13 where Samaria is mentioned again as well, but since it's written after the fact, it's written because the readers would have understood where it was. But this is the first place where, as we know it, Judea, Samaria is mentioned as kind of more of a geographical location based upon this hill that was purchased from Shemer, which Samaria is kind of a play on that name, that proper name of that man who owned this area. So it's a hill and then the surrounding area that was expanded majorly to be Judea and Samaria, Judea being around Jerusalem, Samaria being more to the north of that and a little bit to the east. So it's, again, geographical area that's being referred to here. So it tells us, in the 31st year of Asa, the king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel, and he reigned for 12 years. 6 years he reigned in Tisra, and then he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. So the moving of the capital is this, to this place. There he built on the hill, and he called the name of the city that he built Samaria, and the name of after the name of Shemer, the owner of the hill. So there was an actual city that was mentioned as far as Samaria, but we know it in more the geographical location. Feel free to go ahead and pull up a map if you want to see what Samaria would be considered versus Judea. So verse 25. Actually, when you hear this now, sorry for a little side note, when you hear people refer to Judea and Samaria in the current times, thinking back to even what Jesus said, go into Judea, Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the world. When we look at it now, Jewish people would call Samaria what we would call now or look at as kind of the West Bank. In particular, the stuff that is to the north and a little bit to the east. That's what's seen as Samaria, is that place where the Palestinian Authority has a lot of coverage, and that's where you find a lot of the disputed places. So that gives you an idea what we're talking about here. Now, in verse 25, it tells us Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did even worse than all those who were before him, and he walked in the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. If you haven't noticed this, Jeroboam is the gold standard that they are compared against. Though they become progressively more wicked, that doesn't necessarily matter because they're all being referred to back to the guy who started all of this disaster, that being Jeroboam. So it says, he walked in the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, in verse 26, and in his sin by which he made Israel sin, provoking the Lord of Israel, the Lord God of Israel, to anger with their idols. Again, it's very much a repeating phrase that just says what was their provocation. Verse 27, it says, now the rest of the acts of Omri, what he did, the might that he had showed, and are they not written in the book of the Chronicles? So Omri rested with his fathers. So this is kind of just the ending of each of those close out of their history as we see. It's kind of just, again, it becomes repetitious. You can say this guy, when he's introduced, walked in a way that was provoking to the Lord, and they got into idolatry, and he sinned as bad as anybody else. And at the end of his life, he died, and everything that he did, it's already written in the book of the Chronicles, and then it closes out. So, verse 29. Now, in the 38th year of Asa, so that tells you how much time has gone by. Another 12 years, Asa is still the king in the south. This is the progression through the north. So, Ahab, rather, is mentioned. Let's just read it again. In the 38th year of Asa, the king of Judah, Ahab, the son of Omri, became king over Israel, and Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel for 22 years. Again, real wicked guy. Why God takes this particular point to really expand on the interaction of this particular king and his wife and Elijah is probably because of the importance of Elijah. This is where we're going to be introduced to him. And so, does that mean that there were no prophets? Well, no, clearly, because remember, some of the other prophets that we heard mentioned just briefly were pronouncing judgments that were going to be coming upon the nation for the wickedness that they had done. So it isn't as though there were no prophets, but Elijah becomes kind of center stage here, and he confronts what's going on in the north. So in verse 30, it says, "Now Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him." Now, this is telling us, that's now the third time I think that we've seen that. What it tells you is that the person before them was as bad as there had ever been. The next guy was worse. So that's what it tells us of Ahab here. So it says, "It came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat." It's an easy thing to kind of roll off the tongue as you read it, but really consider what's being said there. This is Israel. These are the descendants of Abraham. These are the people that are the descendants of those who came into the land during Joshua's time. And the things that have been, this is a succession of people that were kings over Israel. And at one time, there wasn't a north and a south. They can all look back to David, and this is what they're about now. The amount of wickedness is just amazing. So it was a trivial thing to him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He took as his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians, and he went and he served Baal and worshipped him. So this is not just as with what Solomon did by allowing it to take place. This is outright, he, the king of Israel, began to actively worship a false god. The king of Israel, of the northern tribes. Amazing. So then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built at Samaria. So remember, Samaria was built for this purpose of being the headquarters, if you will, or the part of the kingdom where he would be reigning, and that would be the capital, if you will. He builds a whole altar and a temple worship place for a false god in Israel. That tells you how bad things had become. So in his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundations with Ibarim, his firstborn, and with his youngest son Segub, he set up its gates according to the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through Joshua the son of Nun. Now that's Joshua 6:26, where God said, when Jericho is taken down, let no man rebuild it. This is what a man who's, again, everybody's building cities. Here's a man of some prominence who's going to rebuild Jericho. God said, don't rebuild it. It was going to cost him his two sons that are mentioned here by name. That's the price for being disobedient. Pretty heavy stuff. And it's said almost just kind of matter of fact. Pretty amazing. So chapter 17, verse 1 tells us this. Now, Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Abraham, as the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word. So God raises up Elijah in this time. And again, Ahab has had a whole lot of time to do the things that he's done, and the wickedness and idolatry is really starting to ramp up at this point. So God sends a prophet, in this case Elijah. Now it says that he's from the area of Gilead, and so more than likely Elijah is more than likely from the tribe of Gad. Now if you're looking at the river Jordan, and if you remember, there were three of the tribes, the eastern half of Manasseh, that had gone up here. It's on the other side, so it's Jordan, modern day, if we want to think of it, Jordan, Syria area. And that would be Manasseh. Below that would be Gad. Below that would be Reuben. And the place that is mentioned here where he came from is really technically right on the Jordan River, and it is technically in the place of the allotment of the land to Gad, the tribe of Gad. So that's what we're looking at here. That's where he had come from. So he said all these things, and of the inhabitants of Gilead, verse 1 of chapter 17, he says, there's not going to be rain until I say so. Now, of course, it's God who says so. He's using Elijah as the person to mouth these words. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Now get away from here, and turn eastward, and hide in the brooks Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. Now, this is also kind of from where he would have already been living. This would have been to the north of where that would have been. From what we can best tell, it appears as though kind of the consensus is this is a brook that runs out of Jordan towards the Jordan River, and that's where he went. It's kind of remote, it's kind of out of the way where he would have been. We know that because of how God had to sustain him. So get away from here, turn eastward, and hide in the brook Chinnereth, which flows to the Jordan, and it will be that you will drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. Isn't that cool? The idea that birds would be the ones to bring him morning and night. Now, people might look at that and they think, okay, it can't really be birds. It has to be, that's a metaphor for something else. God had somebody else that he raised up. And here's the funny thing about it. God would have had to communicate to somebody either way. If they want to try to make it about people, there's no reason to do that. There's no reason to make it metaphor. However it would be, God supernaturally provides by causing, in this case, birds, and there's no reason to try to make it a metaphor for people. Either way, God has to miraculously communicate to get these things to the person at the particular place where he is. So the idea that God would use animals, in this case ravens, to bring him food every single day, morning and night, as he stays there, while God is really enacting just a really horrible hardship because of the wickedness of Ahab in that part of the world. It's so cool. I love how God does these things. So, let's see. So the ravens then in verse 5 rather. So he did according to the word of the Lord, and he went and he stayed at the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. Ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So all that he needed to sustain him was given to him because of God, where God directed him. So he has water, but now he's getting his sustenance morning and night from the ravens. Amazing. So verse 7. And it happened after a while that the brook dried up. Now, why is that? Because there had been no rain in the land. So even in an area that is outside, technically, of what we would consider as the nation of Israel, though it is still within the land allotment of Manasseh and Gad in that area, still nonetheless, because there's no rain in the area, there's no tributaries that bring water into the Jordan, and so even his source dries up. So what does God send him? Now here's the cool thing. God's doing two things at once. He is exacting his wrath against Ahab in the north, but he is also going to send Elijah because he has other things for him to do. Now think of it this way. Jordan River, and he's over in this area here, okay? God's going to send him all the way up to the coast of what is modern day, the Lebanon, Syria area along the Mediterranean coast, all for one specific reason. And there's a lot of other things. He would have been there for a while. So we know that many things would have been taking place, but only what gets focused on here is, it leads us to the place that, yes, God holds him and keeps him safe, sends him to a different place, because it's not good for him to be where the wrath is being poured out on the north. But he sends him to such an interesting place, and some very significant things happen. So we see in verse 8, so the word of the Lord came to him, and saying, Arise and then go to Zarephath, and there it belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow who will provide for you. So he arose and he went to Zarephath, And he came to the gate of the city. Indeed, a widow was there gathering sticks, and he called to her and said, "Please bring me a drink of water in a cup that I may drink." And as she was going to get it, he called her and said, "Please bring me a morsel of bread from your hand, or in your hand." Now, there's a lot that's not being, that kind of leaves us asking or questioning a little bit, trying to figure out how this is all working. Because remember, God says, "I've raised up this widow to do this." So it would give the impression that God has already in some way put it to her that this is what's going to be taking place, but it looks so kind of almost unofficial. Is Elijah completely up to speed on that this is the person? That seems to happen pretty quickly thereafter, you'll see. So Elijah says to her, as she was going to get it, then he called to her and said, "Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." And so she said, "As the Lord your God lives." So she recognizes him, at least at this point, knows that this is somebody from that part of Israel. If nothing else, it would seem as though she has some kind of an idea that something like this is coming up, but not all of the details. As you'll see, what his request is seeming to her a death sentence. So she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread only, but a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go and to prepare it for myself and for my son, that he may eat it and die." So this is the recognition, I don't have much of anything, and it's just going to be enough to sustain us for a short amount of time. And if it's just that she's thinking only her son, or her as well, but they're at the end of things, it's not going to last much longer. So Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and for your son." So there's a couple of ways that people will look at this. Is this really that Elijah was that hungry and that he needed something to eat, and he was saying, "Look, I know that you don't have much, but do what you said you were going to do, but make sure that you give some or reserve some for me"? Because of how awkward and weird this is, it really does give the impression that it's going to put her in the place of, do you trust? And so would you even be willing to share a morsel of this, even though you don't think you have enough really to sustain yourself and your son for any length of time? So the idea that she would have to depend and believe that he is able to do what he says he would do. So he says this, and here's why. Now, he didn't just leave her hanging, because he says this: "For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth." So this whole drought and everything else was even affecting up there as well. So clearly that's a problem. And we would know this because you would figure that if there is water up there as a source, it would make its way into the north as well, because that's where water runs. Okay, so running down that way. In verse 15, "So she went away and she did according to the word of Elijah, and she and her household ate for many days. However, the bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry. According to the word of the Lord, which God spoke by Elijah." So it wasn't just Elijah saying, "I'll make you a deal." Rather, it was that God said to Elijah, "Tell her this." And God's going to be the one who's going to perform this miracle day by day. Now, not difficult for us to understand how this would happen. God has done this so often in so many different ways, whether it was the manna that was given to them, or whether it's Jesus feeding the thousands with just enough from what a kid would have had for lunch, basically. The idea that God makes out of whole cloth those things which doesn't exist, or which didn't exist, again, it's not a problem for him. This is what he's going to do to show himself mighty and to show himself able. So the bin of flour, none of it went. It was able to completely sustain them. Now here's an interesting thing, because the next part of this chapter really kind of goes to a place where this woman wasn't completely convinced, seemingly, because now there's a problem with her son, and it's going to take this miraculous thing that is done by Elijah for her to actually go, as if the bread thing wasn't enough, now I believe. So verse 17. So it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, and his sickness was so serious that there was no breath left in him. And so there are people who would say, even Josephus said he wasn't really dead, he was just gravely ill. Well, no breath left in him, and really there's nothing that gives us the impression that he's sick. If he's just sick, then you would assume that he would end up ultimately recovering. But either way, this would have led to, if not already dead. I personally believe that this is a resurrection from the dead. So she said to Elijah, "What have I to do with you?" It's her way of saying, what's come between us? Why is this happening? And she sees him as really, what is going on and why has this happened? And sees him as the source of it for some reason. She says, "What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" It's an accusation. Now, whatever sin this is, whether there was something that she had on her mind or whether it was just sin in the most general sense of it, and somehow she's being held accountable because of Elijah. And he said to her, "Give me your son." And so he took him out of her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and he laid him on his own bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, and he said, "O Lord my God, you have also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son." So for those people who were saying, well, he wasn't dead, is this a killing in the way of past tense, or was he actively in the sense of dying? Once again, people can go ahead and disagree on it all the time. Here's what we do know. Had God not intervened in this kid would have been dead, if not already there. So let people go ahead and there's arguments that are made because of the grammar that is there in the original language, and so you know, people disagree on it. Either way, had there not been intervention, we all know what would have taken place. So he stretched out himself on the child those 3 times, and the stretching out is that covering him, and you know, as he's bowing and praying. So he said, stretched himself out those 3 times, cried out to the Lord, and said, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." So the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. So Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper room into the house, and he gave him to the mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son now lives." Verse 24. Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is in your mouth, and that it is truth." So, again, I guess that the miracle of being enough oil and bread wasn't enough. Now she has seen this, and it's enough for her to believe that there is this actual valid thing that's taking place. So anyway, this really does, though, kind of set up, if you will, the position that Elijah had and the importance of him as being a prophet, and this gives real credibility to the things that made him who he was. Now, again, this is all done. If we didn't know this history, it wouldn't have changed a whole lot. We don't have to have that little narrative that we had there with him going up to Sidon. It would be enough that God said, "Go to Ahab, tell him there's going to be a drought. And it's not going to stop until I say so," and then sends him away. We have this little bit of information here too, and now we see in chapter 18, "And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth." So 3 years this has been going on, and God sends him back now. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab, and there was a severe famine in Samaria. And Ahab had called Obadiah, who was in charge of the house, and now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. It's just a coincidence that this is a man named Obadiah. It's not the prophet, because he was quite a bit later, around Jeremiah's time. So still a ways into history here. And so it was, while Jezebel massacred the prophets, that Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them, 50 to a cave, and then he had fed them with bread and with water. And Ahab said to Obadiah, go into the land to all the springs of water, go to all the brooks, and perhaps there we may find grass that we can keep our horses and mules alive, so that we will not have to kill any of our livestock. And so they divided up the land between them to explore it. Ahab went one way by himself. Obadiah went the other way by himself. So as Obadiah was on the way, suddenly Elijah met him. Excuse me. So Elijah's coming back from the north, and this is where he encounters Obadiah. So he recognized him, fell on his face, and he said, is that you, my lord Elijah? And so he answered him, and he says, it is I. Now go and tell your master that Elijah is here. Now this is going to get really wordy here, because Obadiah is going to, instead of just getting right to it and said, wait a minute, man, if I tell him that you're here, you're not going to show up and he's going to kill me. He could have said it in a sentence, but listen to how it gets really wordy. So he says, how have I sinned that you are delivering your servant into the hands of Ahab to kill me? As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to hunt for you. And when they said he is not here, he took an oath from the kingdom or the nation that they could not find you. And now you say, go and tell your master that Elijah is here. Now, here again, let's stop for just a moment on something that's a little bit unrelated. Ahab is right now, his part of the nation is suffering under a drought, and it was announced because of Elijah, because of the wickedness of Ahab. Once again, here's one of those places where the person's personal wickedness is what's bringing about God's judgment on that person, and what that person wants to do is kill the messenger, rather than saying, what could I do to remedy this? How about if I go before the Lord and find a way to fix this? Because instead, I want to find Elijah and make this stop, rather than going right to the source and dealing with it. It just shows how wickedness, when it overruns a person, it just shuts down their ability to think rationally. Well, so he says to him, it shall come to pass, as soon as I am gone from you, that the Spirit of the Lord will carry you away to a place that I do not know. And so when I go and I tell Ahab, and he cannot find you, then he will kill me. But I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth. Was it not reported to my Lord that I had done this, what I had done when Jezebel started to kill the prophets of the Lord, how I had 100 men of the Lord's prophets, 50 to a cave, and I had fed them with bread and water? Why are you doing this to me? Haven't you heard that I've done rightly by the Lord? And so he said, go and tell your master Elijah is here, and why are you doing this? Because he'll kill me if I say this to him. Here's what Elijah says to him in verse 15. Elijah said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will surely present myself to him this day. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. Verse 17. It happened when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said to him, is that you, O troubler of Israel? I love Elijah's response here. What's the trouble of Israel? Drought. What's the cause? Ahab wants to make it about Elijah. Elijah is going to say, no, you're the problem. And so he answered, he says, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house have, and that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals, the false gods of the Sidonians and the people outside of Israel, the people that are along the coast. So in verse 19, now therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So there is going to be a bit of a contest here. Now I'm going to put up a picture of this because Mount Carmel is known to us. And so as you look at it, Carmel is kind of right at the north, kind of the northwest portion of the Jezreel Valley. So the Valley of Armageddon, Jezreel Valley, whatever you want to call it, lays out in front of you in this direction. It kind of goes to the southeast. So in that valley is the city of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, Megiddo, which was a fortification, it's just kind of a citadel type of a fortress, I guess you can call it. It's a tell now, but it's called Megiddo. And then further into the valley is where you get to Bet Shean. It goes ultimately to the Jordan River. Gilboa, where Saul died. It's all in that valley. That stuff is all there. It's just a little bit below the Sea of Galilee as it starts to exit towards the south. So this is the area. And Carmel would have been there's a whole series of mountain hills, if you want to call it that. And it looks, again, towards the east. Behind you is the Mediterranean. So it's much closer to the coast than much of anything else that we ever hear about of the kind of places where events happen in the Bible. This is getting much closer to the coast. So anyway, you can look it up on a map, but I'll show you some pictures from Carmel. So with that being said, verse 20, so Ahab sent for all the children of Israel, gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel, and Elijah came to the people, and he said, how long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal, follow him. But the people answered him not a word. Of course, they're not going to pick sides at this point. Now, again, there's the fear of Ahab, of course. But then there's also that they're not going to go after Elijah either. And you would figure there's probably a lot of reason for them to not like him, but they know that they must know somehow it's probably not best to pick a fight with him. And it doesn't seem as though they really know what's about to happen. So Elijah said to the people, I alone am left, a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Therefore, let's do this. This is kind of how about we do something here? He says, therefore, let's have two bulls. Give us two bulls. Let them choose one for themselves, cut it into pieces, and lay it on the wood, and then put no fire under it, and I will prepare the other bull. Lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. So equal things. Give us two bulls, let them pick the first one. Let them go ahead and do their sacrifice, put it in place. Don't light anything. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Now, when you call on the name of the Lord, or the name of your gods, I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, then he is God. So all the people answered, and they said, it is well spoken. So now it's this specific. We will put up equal the same kind of an offering. I'll put mine here. They can put theirs there. Whichever one gets consumed and whichever one catches fire, it will be obvious that it's God who has done it. So everybody says, great idea. Let's do that. So in verse 25, now Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one bull for yourselves, prepare it first, for you are many, and call on the name of the Lord your God, but put no fire under it. And so they took the bull which was given to them, they prepared it, they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. And there was no voice, no one answered, and they leaped about the altar which had been made. So they're really working themselves up from morning till afternoon. They're really trying to get this thing done, and nothing is happening. Look at what it says. And so it was at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, cry aloud, for he is a God. Either he is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. This is like real, high-grade trash talking. Must have enraged these guys. Well, you can see they reacted. So they cried aloud, and they cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and with lances until blood gushed out of them. So the sacrifice of the bull wasn't enough. Now they're going to start inflicting damage to themselves, and still nothing happens. When midday was past, they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, but there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. So they've had all day at this, and nothing is taking place. So verse 30, so Elijah said to the people, come near me. So all the people came near him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. So this would have been a place at one time where proper type of worship would have taken place to some extent, whatever it may be, and there was a reparation that needed to be made. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of Jacob. And he says, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. So he reminds them of their history by using these stones to say, I don't care what's going on in the north or the south, or what's happening here, or all of the idolatry and all the rest of it. We are in the land of the place that God had given to the 12 tribes. And this was going to be the reminder. So When he took the stones, he built them in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. Now, a seah is about a third of an ephah. These are just, you can look up all these measurements. We don't know how big the trench would be. We don't know how big the altar was. This is just told to us to give us an idea. It wasn't just making a little small, thing around it. It was a kind of a trench built around it. It was huge. Whatever it was, big enough that you'd be able to put water in it, and everybody would know that it's not just moist ground. There's water. So it says, and he put wood in order, cut the bull into pieces, laid it on the wood, and said, now fill 4 water pots with water, and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood. And then he said, do it a second time. And they did it for a second time. And he says, now do it for a third time. And they did it a third time. So the water ran all around the altar, and he also filled the trench with the water. So imagine this, however big it is, he prepares it, he does the sacrifice the way that it's supposed to be, tells a bunch of people, get these pitchers of water and soak the offering, make it wet. Put it on the wood. Wood does not burn when it's wet. Do it 3 separate times, and now fill the water around in that trough that was built around it. So what you have is quite a spectacle here. Now, verse 36. And it came to pass at the time of the offering, that the evening sacrifice, that Elijah the prophet came near, and he said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are the God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. That's important. So here in this case, he has gone over the top in making this an impossible thing to have happen. And he says, now, Lord, do what needs to be done so that they will know that you have had these words. It's not me. And he's not drawing attention to himself. Interesting and very important. Hear me, O Lord, and hear me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again. It's too bad it wouldn't last. So then fire from the Lord fell, and it consumed the burnt sacrifice. And this idea of burnt sacrifice is a trespass offering going back to Leviticus. So this is the idea of making atonement for sin. That's what is being done here. It's not just a spectacle. This was done. Elijah would have known what it is to do this in the proper order. So he says this, and then fire from the Lord fell, consumed the burnt sacrifice, the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. And now when the people saw it, they fell to their faces, and they said, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. And Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape. And so they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there. You can still find all this stuff. It's all still there. This brook would be in, as you go down into the Jezreel Valley. So the prophets of Baal were killed in the Valley of Armageddon. It's in front of Carmel as you start to go into the valley. So it says in verse 41, so Elijah said to Ahab, now go up, eat and drink, for there is a sound of abundance of rain. So Ahab went up to eat and to drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Carmel. And when he bowed down to the ground, he put his face between his knees, and he said to his servant, go up now and look towards the sea. And he sent him, and he looked, and he said, there is nothing. So 7 times he said, now go and do this again. Now, the idea that there's 7 times, is it just an arbitrary number, or is there a reason for it? We certainly know that 7 days is a number of completion. And so remember the days that we were given as a week. And so there were 6 days, and then that 7th day of rest. So if there's symbolism in this, it is the sense of it's completed. So it took this 7 times to see what he was about to see. So it came to pass on the 7th time, verse 44, that there was a cloud as small as a man's hand rising up out of the sea. And so he said, go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. It's going to get rainy. Now, it happened in the meantime that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain. So Ahab rode away and went to Jezreel, so down in the valley, heading towards the southeastern portion of it. So the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he girded up his loins, and he ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. So he's going to make a big deal of this, and we're going to pick it up next week in chapter 19. There's just too much to try to deal with next. But this is when news gets back to Jezebel. And where we can show where all of this took place is what's so intriguing about it. So we'll pick up next week at chapter 19, and we'll get the response of Jezebel, which we probably already know. There's still much of history that's still going to be dealt with when it comes to Ahab and Jezebel and Elijah. There's still a lot for us to glean through this. So we'll pick up there next week. If you have any questions on what we've looked at this time, feel free to contact us through the website. The email is there. It is oldpaththeology.net, and you can use the email contact us part of the page and send us an email if you have any questions. So we'll pick up there next week. Lots to study. Go ahead and read ahead if you'd like to, and it's always very, very interesting. This is, to me, it's a fascinating part of their history. And it's even cooler that you can actually see parts of this. So we'll pick up there next week. I pray that in the meantime that God blesses your study of His Word.